I never imagined the quiet suburb I moved into would turn into a battlefield. What started as a simple dispute over a patch of grass spiraled into something darker, something that shook my family to its core. One day, my wife walked outside to enjoy the morning air, and within minutes, she was surrounded, cornered, and humiliated by the very people who claimed to protect the neighborhood. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules anymore, they were enforcing power, and when they crossed the line, I knew I couldn't stay silent. But the real question is, how far would they go to keep control? When my family first moved into the neighborhood, we thought we had found peace. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges, kids rode their bikes in the evenings, and the air carried that calm suburban quiet most people spend their lives chasing. For a while, it felt perfect. My wife loved planting flowers by the porch, and I enjoyed early morning jogs around the block, waving at neighbors who seemed just as content as we were. But beneath the manicured lawns and friendly smiles, there was something else at work, something most newcomers didn't notice right away. Every house had to match a certain standard, every lawn inspected like it was part of a military drill, and every action quietly judged by the board that claimed to keep the community safe and beautiful. At first, it all seemed harmless. A letter here, a reminder there, mow the grass, fix the paint, keep things tidy. But the more I looked, the more I noticed a pattern. Some families were singled out, while others got away with far worse. The rules weren't about fairness, they were about power. And it was only a matter of time before that power found its way to my front door. It didn't take long for the first letter to arrive. A plain white envelope slid under our door, stamped with the HOA's official seal. Inside, a warning. Our flower beds were not in compliance with community guidelines. My wife had planted tulips and marigolds, bright bursts of color against the endless beige facades of the street. But according to the board, only shrubs of approved height and tone were acceptable. They called it aesthetic consistency. I called it control. We laughed it off at first. It was just flowers. Surely they had better things to worry about. But within days, another notice arrived. This time citing our trash bins, which had been placed at the curb 15 minutes too early. The fine, $50. A week later, we were cited again for leaving a bicycle in plain view. My son's bike left leaning against the porch for all of 20 minutes. Another fine. The message was clear. We were being watched. Neighbors whispered about the HOA president, a man named Richard Hayes. Retired, wealthy, with too much time on his hands and a hunger for control. People said he drove the neighborhood at night, clipboard in hand, noting every violation, no matter how small. Some shrugged it off. Others stayed quiet out of fear. But we were new here, and Hayes had decided to make us his example. The fines stacked higher, the letters grew sharper, and soon the harassment took a darker turn. One afternoon, I returned from work to find a board member standing in my driveway, tape measure in hand. He claimed he was checking the width of our hedges. Another time, a neighbor nervously told me they'd been asked to report if they saw us breaking any rules. The HOA wasn't just watching, they were recruiting others to watch for them. The pressure wore on us. My wife felt anxious every time she watered the garden, worried someone was snapping photos. My kids whispered about the spy neighbors. The peace we had once felt here was gone, replaced by a constant sense of being judged, monitored, and punished. Still, I tried to stay calm. I paid the fines, I trimmed the hedges, I put the trash out only at the exact approved minute. But the more I complied, the more they pushed. It was as if my obedience wasn't enough. They wanted submission. The breaking point came when my wife was confronted directly. It was early evening, the sun dipping low as she stepped outside to check the mailbox. 3 HOA board members were waiting at the curb. They surrounded her, waving papers, demanding immediate payment for unsettled violations. When she tried to walk past them, they blocked her path, their voices rising, their words cutting. One of them even shoved a paper into her chest, so hard it crumpled against her blouse. She came inside shaking, her hands trembling as she clutched the wrinkled notice. "They cornered me," she whispered. "Right there in front of everyone." That was when something inside me shifted. This was no longer about flowers or bikes or bins. This was harassment. This was intimidation. And I wasn't going to let it continue. But the HOA wasn't finished yet. The next week, a new rule was introduced, a noise ordinance. According to Hayes, children playing in yards after 6 p.m. violated community tranquility. It was a thinly veiled attack on families like ours. The very next evening, as my kids laughed and chased each other across the lawn, a board member appeared with a camera, recording them as evidence. My children, recorded like criminals for the crime of playing in their own yard. The rage in me boiled, but I knew I had to be smart. I began documenting everything: the notices, the fines, the photos, even the dates and times of each confrontation. What I uncovered was staggering. Dozens of families fined for petty infractions, while Hayes's allies escaped untouched. One board member's lawn was littered with weeds, another had an unapproved paint color on their shutters. Yet they faced no consequences. The rules weren't rules at all. They were weapons used selectively to punish and control. The more I dug, the more resistance I faced. Late one night, I discovered my car's tire slashed. Days later, my wife's garden was mysteriously trampled, flowers crushed into the dirt. We had no proof, but we knew who wanted us gone. Still, I pressed on, gathering evidence and preparing to fight back. And the HOA must have sensed it, because their next move was the boldest yet. A certified letter arrived, not just a fine this time, but a threat. According to the board, if we didn't bring our property into compliance, they would place a lien on our home. They wanted our house, our safe haven, our future, all over tulips, trash bins, and laughter. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter, I realized the truth. This wasn't about maintaining beauty or order. This was about power. Absolute, unchecked power. And the more I resisted, the more dangerous they became. I had a choice: bend, break, or fight back with everything I had. But what I didn't know then was just how far the HOA was willing to go, and how explosive the confrontation ahead would be. The lien notice was the final straw. I had swallowed their petty fines, endured the harassment, and documented every insult. But this was an attack on the very roof over my family's head. They wanted to strip us of the one thing we had built with years of sacrifice. And in that moment, I knew the fight had reached its breaking point. I spent days preparing. Every letter, every fine, every photo I had taken was sorted and copied. I filed complaints with the state attorney general, reached out to other homeowners, and discovered I wasn't alone. Families whispered their own horror stories: threats of foreclosure over garden gnomes, harassment for wind chimes, intimidation at community meetings. The pattern was clear. Hayes and his board weren't guardians of order. They were predators, preying on anyone who resisted. The annual HOA meeting loomed on the calendar, a gathering where attendance was usually thin. But this time, I made sure the seats would be full. I went door to door, knocking, speaking softly but firmly, telling neighbors what was happening to us and what could happen to them next. Some were hesitant, some afraid, but others, tired of living under a microscope, promised they would stand with me. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse parking lot overflowed. The board members weren't expecting a crowd. Hayes strutted in, as always, chest puffed out, eyes scanning the room with smug confidence. He tapped his gavel against the wooden table, calling the meeting to order, his voice dripping with authority. "Tonight," he began, "we will address matters of compliance and future improvements to our community standards." But for once, he wasn't in control. I stood up, clutching a thick binder. My voice shook at first, but anger steadied it. "Before we talk about improvements, let's talk about abuse. Let's talk about harassment. Let's talk about how this board has crossed every line of fairness and decency." The room went silent. Hayes' smile faltered. He tried to wave me down, claiming I was out of order, but I pressed on. I flipped open the binder and began to read. The fines, the letters, the dates, photos of board members trespassing, measuring, intimidating, testimonies from neighbors who had quietly suffered for years. Every piece of evidence laid bare under the fluorescent lights of that clubhouse. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman in the back stood and shouted, "That happened to us too!" Another neighbor raised his hand, recounting how Hayes had threatened to fine him thousands for painting his shutters the wrong shade of brown. The room, once passive and polite, was now electric with anger. Hayes slammed his gavel, his voice rising. "This is slander. None of this is admissible." But the tide had turned. One by one, neighbors stood, emboldened by the evidence. Stories poured out: bullying, threats, retaliation. People Hayes had counted on to remain silent were now speaking louder than ever. For the first time, he wasn't feared. He was cornered. I pulled out the final card I had been holding back. A letter from an attorney, my attorney, stating that if the board continued its harassment, they would face legal action, including a motion to dissolve the HOA's authority for misconduct and abuse of power. The room erupted. Cheers, shout-outs, pounding fists on tables. Hayes's face drained of color. He barked orders at his fellow board members, but their eyes betrayed him. Some looked down in shame. Others stared at me with something close to fear. The climax of the night came when one neighbor, an older man who had lived in the community for over 20 years, rose to his feet and declared, "I motion to remove Richard Hayes as president of this board, effective immediately." The clubhouse roared. Hayes screamed, his voice cracking, insisting it wasn't legal, that procedure had to be followed. But it was too late. The very rules he had twisted to control others were now being used against him. The board scrambled, papers flying, as residents demanded a vote. And then it happened. Hands shot up across the room, a sea of defiance. Nearly every neighbor stood in unison, their voices thundering through the hall. Aye! For the first time in years, Hayes was powerless. His gavel slipped from his hand, clattering uselessly onto the table. His reign of intimidation had collapsed in a single night, under the weight of truth and collective outrage. But victory didn't feel like relief just yet, because Hayes wasn't finished. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, he pointed a shaking finger at me and spat. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." The words hung in the air like poison, a reminder that even when tyrants are toppled, they don't go quietly. That night, as I walked back to my car, the cool air on my face, neighbors clapping my shoulder, thanking me for standing up, I felt both triumph and unease. Yes, the community had finally spoken. Yes, Hayes had been stripped of his title, but I knew him well enough to understand he wouldn't vanish without a fight. The battle for our neighborhood wasn't finished. It had only shifted into its most dangerous phase. The days following the HOA meeting felt surreal. For years, neighbors had lived under Richard Hayes' shadow, speaking in whispers, trimming their lawns with military precision, and tiptoeing around rules that were less about beauty and more about obedience. Now, overnight, that grip had been broken. But breaking something is different from repairing it. And in the weeks that followed, the community faced a hard question. What kind of neighborhood did we want to be? At first, there was confusion. Without Hayes barking orders, some residents worried the streets would fall into chaos. A few board members even tried to cling to power, insisting that without strict enforcement, property values would collapse. But the truth was, people weren't asking for chaos. They were asking for balance, for fairness, for freedom to live without fear of harassment. I spent hours sitting with neighbors, hearing their stories in full detail. An elderly woman described how Hayes had fined her $200 because she couldn't afford to repaint her fence on time. A single father admitted he'd paid thousands over noise violations whenever his teenage son played music in the garage. One family even confessed they had thought about moving away, just to escape the relentless pressure. Hearing these stories lit a fire in me. This fight wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about every person who had been bullied into silence. And that meant the resolution couldn't just be Richard Hayes' removal. It had to be deeper. So we got organized. We called for a special election to fill the vacant board seats. This time, instead of backroom nominations and empty promises, neighbors campaigned openly. People who had once been too afraid to speak now stood tall, vowing to bring transparency and fairness back to our community. And when the votes were cast, the results were overwhelming. The old guard was swept out, replaced with residents who wanted rules that served the people, not the other way around. The first changes were simple but symbolic. Fines were reduced to reasonable amounts, with warnings issued first instead of threats. Families were allowed to plant flowers, paint their doors, and let their kids play without fear of a citation. The board even created an open forum where residents could voice concerns without being silenced or mocked. Slowly, the neighborhood began to heal. I remember walking outside one Saturday morning and seeing something I hadn't witnessed in years. Children playing freely, laughter echoing down the block, parents standing nearby with smiles instead of worry. Lawns weren't perfect, paint shades varied, and yes, trash bins occasionally lingered at the curb longer than allowed. But instead of looking like failure, it looked like life. Real, messy, imperfect life. And that's what a neighborhood should be. But not everything was resolved so easily. Richard Hayes didn't disappear. He fought tooth and nail, filing appeals, sending letters, and even threatening lawsuits. For months, he tried to claw back control, insisting the vote was illegitimate and that he had been the victim of a smear campaign. But the truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It was out in the open, with dozens of families willing to testify against him. His reputation collapsed under the weight of his own actions. Eventually, the county stepped in. After reviewing the complaints and the evidence we had gathered, they launched an investigation. What they found was damning. Years of financial mismanagement, favoritism in enforcement, and possible misuse of HOA funds. Hayes went from barking orders with a gavel to hiring a lawyer to defend himself against potential charges. For my family, the impact was more personal. My wife, who once trembled at the thought of stepping outside, found her confidence again. She replanted her garden, this time bigger and brighter than before. Every tulip and marigold was a silent declaration. We are no longer afraid. My children, who had grown used to whispers and warnings, learned an invaluable lesson, that standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, can change everything. But perhaps the most unexpected outcome was the bond that formed among neighbors. Strangers who had once avoided each other for fear of gossip now stood side by side. We hosted block parties, shared meals, and laughed about the absurdity of the HOA police days. Unity grew out of conflict, and the scars left by Hayes's reign slowly turned into something stronger: resilience. Of course, there were still challenges. Some residents remained bitter, loyal to Hayes, or wary of the new leadership. Old habits die hard. But for the first time, the majority had a voice, and that voice was louder than fear. Looking back, the irony isn't lost on me. The HOA claimed to protect property values and community standards. But in reality, it was people like Hayes who nearly destroyed the very fabric of our neighborhood. It wasn't uniform paint colors or perfectly trimmed lawns that made a place valuable. It was the freedom to live, to grow, to be human without the weight of constant judgment. And that's the takeaway I want anyone watching this to remember. Because HOA disputes aren't just about grass length, paint shades, or trash schedules. They're about power. They're about what happens when authority is left unchecked and when ordinary people are too afraid to speak. They're about how easy it is for control to masquerade as order and how dangerous that illusion can become. But they're also about something else: the power of community. The moment neighbors stop hiding and start standing together, the game changes. Fear loses its grip. Bullies lose their throne, and ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary things. In the end, the HOA didn't just teach me about unfair rules. It taught me about courage, resilience, and the strength that comes when families refuse to be broken. Today, when I step onto my porch and see the garden blooming, when I hear my kids laughing as they ride their bikes down the street, I know the fight was worth it. Because every tulip, every bicycle, every burst of laughter is a reminder of what we won back. Not just our property, but our peace. And as for Hayes, his gavel is silent now. His threats have faded. His name, once feared, is now a cautionary tale whispered with a mix of anger and relief. But the lesson he left behind still echoes. Power only controls as long as people allow it. So, I'll leave you with this question. If it were your home, your family, your peace on the line, would you stand up or would you stay silent and hope the storm passes? Because sooner or later, every neighborhood has its storm. The question is, will you weather it or will you fight to change it?